Hey everyone, welcome to our first fully digital lecture. We are talking about surveillance today. So, today we're going to talk about theories of surveillance and then the advent of surveillance realism. So, let's give a quick overview of the theory of surveillance and how that kind of gets wrapped into thinking how societies work and why that's important. Jeremy Bentham is credited in many ways with coming up with this idea of surveillance. He was an English philosopher who lived in the 18th century, and he came up with the idea that surveillance, when properly applied, can be a good thing. And there's a way in which today surveillance has this negative connotation. We see it as like always bad. But if you're looking at it from political theory, that's not necessarily true. The idea Bentham has is basically that if people are doing stuff in full view of everyone else, they are more likely to act in ways that everyone watching thinks is good. So if everyone is watching everyone do something, it's less likely that anyone will behave badly. This is the underlying idea of freedom of the press. The press can act to bring to light the ways people behave for the public to review. The idea is that if you think you've done nothing wrong, the people should judge you the same. But if you are doing things that they won't like, then with that judgment, you're likely to change your behavior. In Wisconsin, we have this. For instance, you can look up court cases, put addresses into a search engine to find out who lives there, what they paid, and so on. It's a bit like freedom of information, and it can be different in other states, but that information access is very strong here. In the same way, those who hoped for freer or more free forms of government, perhaps something similar to our own as we've seen it, saw surveillance as a mechanism by which this open and public society of the free could be achieved. That feels kind of counterintuitive, that surveillance is the mechanism for freedom. And Bentham is also known for trying to raise funds to create this thing called a panopticon prison. In the picture on the should be right on your screens, you can see this guard tower at the center, and prisoner cells are arranged in such a way that prisoners can't see each other, but the guard tower is always in view. This allows less guards to monitor the prison and keep order, as those at the center can see everything. So, the idea here is that you have some kind of inspector at the center, and the inspector is better at monitoring everyone. But what if the prisoners don't know when the guard is there and when they aren't? What if, instead of everyone watching everyone, like freedom of the press, it is more like someone has the power to install someone to watch everyone? And what if they're hired by the community? Well, it's very expensive to hire someone to go around observing people all the time. So, what if you create a scenario where people don't know when the person is observing, or can't see the person, or perhaps don't even know who that person is? What happens in that scenario? So I want you to think about, like, if you've played Mafia, Secret Hitler, Werewolf, The Resistance, or any other game that has this kind of betrayal mechanic where identities are kept secret. What happens in those games? Think about that for a second. you start accusing each other, right? What happens in these scenarios is we have the all knowing or omniscient I becoming the best way, the most efficient way to surveil people in an effort to keep them behaving in desired ways. The idea is that if you tell a population at any given time they may be being watched, they act like they are being watched all the time. So if you want people to behave right, and you need to hire people to keep them in line, like the police, security guards, you don't need to hire for round the clock observation, but merely make people believe at any point in time they could and therefore are being observed. The idea that we don't really know when we're being surveilled should, based on this theory, make us all behave better. But does it? We can maybe think back to being a teenager, think about high school age you. Did you ever do something stupid in public that could have gotten you in trouble? Were you deterred from doing something stupid because you thought you could be being watched? Something to consider. All right. So for the French theorist Michel Foucault, and I did tell you we'd be getting back to him this week, this theory of surveillance, the theory of the panopticon, becomes a metaphor for how social institutions work, how police, government, the church, how peer pressure through institutions works to regulate and control behavior. The idea is that social groups keep people acting in normative ways because people think they're being observed all the time by the disciplinary power. And because they're afraid of disapproval by these institutions, they behave better. And Foucault's not necessarily saying that this is a bad thing, but if you're trying to create change, to act in ways that are different than before, then this is certainly a bad thing. This is the idea behind disciplinary power. Governments, those who control the ability to surveil, have the ability to enact disciplinary power, which Foucault defines as a type of power that is applied to individuals in the form of continuous individual supervision, in the form of control, punishment, and compensation, and in the form of correction, that is, the modeling and transforming of individuals in terms of certain norms. The sense here with norms. Norms mean what everyone thinks you should do. So if you act different in a society that is constantly threatening to expose your difference as wrong, it causes you to try not to act different. This enforces norms and it limits diversity. It limits our choices. It's how we get concepts like being in the closet, for instance. Masking for neurodivergent people. And it's how bullying becomes so prevalent in K through 12 education. Another French philosopher, Deleuze, expands on this idea in the early 1990s by making a distinction between the disciplinary societies of the past and what he calls a control society. His idea becomes that we had this disciplinary society in which governments norm people through disciplinary control, which results in long-term outcomes that make people behave well and therefore benefit society as a whole. But his concern is that with the advent of big data, we're moving from a disciplinary society, which keeps people in check, which limits some people, but with the intention to benefit society as a whole, to a control society of now. It is no longer that governments are trying to get us to behave rightly, but that corporations are getting us to behave in certain ways. And because they're corporations, they encourage behavior which increases money to shareholders. So it's not that the ways they're getting us to act are about making society better, wanting society to get better. They're motivated by wanting the markets to become richer. So this leads to, instead of the means of control being visible and active, it becomes invisible and opaque. It is not in the interest of corporations to let people know the ways in which they're being controlled. That undermines that control. So this idea is that we move from individuals to what they call dividuals. We are no longer people to these corporations, but just representations of potential sales. We become elements of code. We are reduced to code and big databases that are used by corporations. We're turned into data for profit. Deleuze writes in 1992, in the societies of control, on the other hand, what is important is no longer either a signature or a number, but a code. The code is a password, while on the other hand, disciplinary societies are regulated by watchwords as much as from the point of view of integration as from that of resistance. The numerical language of control is made of codes that mark access to information or reject it. We no longer find ourselves dealing with the mass, the individual pair. Individuals have become dividuals, and masses, samples, data, markets, or banks. The disciplinary man was a discontinuous producer of energy, but the man of control is undulatory, in orbit, in a continuous network. What Deleuze is concerned about is when corporations take control of the surveillance, people are reduced to their choices and behavior in ways that benefit the short-term interests of the corporations, i.e., more immediate monetary gains. And typically, at the risk, at the reduction of long-term societal benefits. And this all gets us to Shoshana Zuboff, who's an American author, a Harvard professor, social psychologist, philosopher, and an all-around scholar. And she argues for this term, surveillance capitalism. The idea is that capitalism has been sort of hijacked or open to the temptation of the possibilities of surveillance because our actions can suggest our choices. Marketeers, the people trying to sell stuff, can use surveillance to monetize our small little actions. They can use surveillance to generate revenue and control markets. What she's talking about here, what we're talking about, is when the Alexa, Siri, Google, etc. listens to us and keeps data summaries of what we say, which is then sold to the marketeers who want to sell us things. Surveillance, constant observation, in this way becomes a commodity, or turns our behaviors into a commodity. And this commodity is one that is more valuable based on the more data you have about more people Whoever controls the big data becomes valuable to those trying to sell stuff. This is not about norming our behaviors or society looking at itself to see who is acting out. It's about those who control access to the data, selling that data to those who want it to raise money, who sell us stuff. That's capitalism, right? And when surveillance becomes valuable as a capital commodity, that's different from before. For a long time, only the prison guard, the government, had the ability to surveil people at a massive level. But corporations now do. And importantly, they have the ability to turn around and sell that information. And if you can afford it, everyone can watch everyone else. If you can afford it. So that brings us to our discussion. This will be your lecture activity for today. This does need to be submitted during the regular lecture time. I've mentioned that in class. I want you in the discussion for surveillance, be very careful which one you're in, to say what are some of the examples of surveillance capitalism that Zuboff talks about? How is surplus data deployed in these examples? What kinds of data that used to be surplus are now in use? And how does your knowledge of surveillance impact your own communication practices? Has anything we've talked about here wanted to make you make any changes to your digital footprint? So they have a few minutes to put that into the chat. I'm going to pause the recording for a second, and then we'll continue on. All right. So all of this gets to the reading that you had about the advent of surveillance realism. This was written by Lena Denkick and Jonathan Cable. Denkick is the director of the Data Justice Lab at the University of Cardiff, and Cable headed the ESRC-funded project Digital Citizenship and Surveillance Society. And in this piece, they're really asking, how would people, both the general public and political activists, react and respond to the Snowden leaks in the UK? Now, usually when I do this lecture in person, I ask how many of you know about Edward Snowden? And typically, at least in recent years, it hasn't been that many of you. So let's talk about Snowden for a bit. Edward Snowden was a whistleblower. In 2013, that was interesting. Technology is fun. In 2013, Snowden leaked NSA secrets regarding surveillance to the public. And then he basically had to flee the country. So, Snowden revealed unprecedented insights into state corporate surveillance programs. Importantly, these programs were not just monitoring business and political espionage or particular suspect actors as we as a society had thought, but were monitoring everyday communications of normal citizens. And at the time, this had a chilling effect on the public, according to Reitman, at least. And the public would now self-police and self-regulate. The public was now more aware of how their use of the internet was constantly being monitored. So, they became more reluctant to discuss politically sensitive topics and privacy sensitive search terms. This led to what Hampton et al. Call the spiral of silence. And I don't know about you, but if I'm saying something that could, out of context, be taken weird and I'm doing it over text or social media, I might use the phrase for any like FBI listening, right? To this jokingly makes clear that we know we're being monitored, and even though we're saying something that could be taken out of context as weird, we're self-policing to clarify that it's innocent, right? According to Greenwald, merely organizing movements of dissent becomes difficult when the government is watching everything people are doing. But mass surveillance kills dissent in a deeper and more important place as well, in the mind, where the individual trains him or herself to think only in line with what is expected and demanded. Greenwald is saying that not only does this form of surveillance make it impossible, make it incredibly difficult at least, for social change to occur, but it also kills that will for change, that acknowledgement that something is wrong, the need for something better inside the self. We accept that this is our reality and that we can't change it. And that's a very sad thing. So, for this class, there is a video that I want you to watch. I cannot play it as part of this recording because YouTube copyright situations. So I want you, it's right underneath the lecture slides. It's right underneath this recording, I should say. Watch this video. Think about how people reacted to the Snowden leaks at the time. Think about, has anything changed? And as you watch that video, you will see his biggest fear was that nothing would change. So I want you to think about that. Give a little bit of a pause here, and then I'll wrap up this lecture recording. All right, so for this lecture, I want you to know that surveillance is a mode of control. Through digital technology, that surveillance can be monetized. And this is shadow operation, right? It's about being invisible. It's the invisible, insidious ways that corporations, especially, are controlling and monitoring behavior. And understand that our responses to surveillance often create a cycle of silence. Before we get into the looking ahead, I do want to note, if you didn't watch that video, it's probably going to be on the quiz. If you didn't watch the Zuboff video that was assigned to you, well, 1, it was the lecture activity. 2, it relates to your lab. 3, it might be on the quiz. So make sure that you do watch these videos. Thursday, we'll talk about privacy. You have 2 readings for that. And other than that, you will have a quiz this week. You have the mid-semester evaluation this week. It is not a test. I want to hear from you what you think is going well in the class, what shouldn't be changed, what you think can be improved. So we'll have that for lecture and lab. This is a key lecture activity. So there is a code word. This is an anonymous survey. You must submit the code word to Canvas to get credit for this assignment. So don't be exiting without making sure that you get that code word. Again, it is anonymous, so unlike with the welcome survey where I could go in and verify, I'm not going to be able to go in and verify. That code word's the only way you get credit. Other thing I want to mention is be recording some video. Make sure you've got some raw footage, because next week Design Lab is going to be coming into lab to work on the editing process with you. If you don't have raw footage to edit, they're not going to be able to help you. You're going to get behind. And if you speak to anyone who has done video production work before, you know that however long it takes you to get the raw footage, expect it to take double that time for the editing process. So get some of that this week. And why don't you go ahead on Thursday? I'll see you in the lecture recording for privacy. All right. Bye all.